An experienced mason, during a simple renovation of an old house, discovers a fortune hidden inside the walls. What seemed to be the solution to all his financial problems became the biggest nightmare of his life. This is the real story of how other people's greed can destroy an entire family and how dirty money never brings happiness. Leave in the comments, would you tell someone if you found millions hidden, or would you keep it secret? Chapter 1. Roberto Silva had spent 25 years of his life building other people's dreams. At 48 years old, his weathered hands told the story of countless construction projects, from humble family homes to luxury mansions for the wealthy. But despite his skill and dedication, Roberto's own dreams seemed perpetually out of reach. Living in a cramped rental house on the outskirts of the city with his wife Carmen and their 2 teenage children, Roberto struggled to make ends meet. His son, Miguel, 17, needed money for college entrance exams, while his daughter Sophia, 15, had outgrown all her clothes and desperately needed new ones for school. Carmen worked double shifts at a local diner, but even their combined income barely covered the basics. The refrigerator was making strange noises that signaled expensive repairs ahead, and their old car needed new tires they couldn't afford. Every month brought new financial pressures that kept Roberto awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering how other families managed to get ahead. It was during one of these sleepless nights that Roberto allowed himself to dream about something he had always wanted, his own woodworking business. He had always been fascinated by fine carpentry and had recently discovered Ted's woodworking, a revolutionary method that was transforming ordinary workers into masters of wood in just weeks. Thousands of people had already changed their financial lives with these techniques, earning $300 to $500 per day working from home. But Roberto still hesitated, knowing that even the small investment required seemed impossible with their current situation. The opportunity that would change everything came through his foreman, Carlos, who approached Roberto on a rainy Tuesday morning at their current job site. "Roberto, I have something that might interest you," Carlos said, pulling him aside from the other workers. "A private client needs renovation work on an old house. It's been abandoned for 15 years, but the new owner wants to fix it up. The pay is good, and you'd be working alone, which means you could set your own schedule." The house was located in an older neighborhood that had seen better days. Once home to middle-class families, the area had gradually declined as businesses moved elsewhere and younger residents relocated to newer developments. Many houses stood empty, their windows boarded up and yards overgrown with weeds. Roberto's first glimpse of the property made him understand why it had remained vacant for so long. The 2-story house, built in the 1970s, showed clear signs of neglect. Paint peeled from the exterior walls like diseased skin, and several roof tiles were missing or cracked. The small front yard was a jungle of overgrown vegetation that nearly obscured the front door, but it was the neighbors' behavior that struck Roberto as truly odd. When he parked his truck in front of the house and began unloading his tools, he noticed curtains moving in nearby windows. Faces appeared briefly before disappearing again, as if the residents were keeping watch but didn't want to be seen doing so. Mrs. Gonzalez, an elderly woman who lived next door, approached Roberto as he was examining the exterior damage. "You're going to work on the Santos house?" she asked, her voice carrying a nervous tremor. "Yes, ma'am, just some renovation work. That house has been trouble since the day the Santos family moved in," she said, glancing around nervously. "Strange people coming and going at all hours, loud arguments, and then one day they just disappeared, left everything behind. What happened to them?" Mrs. Gonzalez shrugged, but her expression suggested she knew more than she was willing to say. "Nobody knows for sure. Some say they moved away suddenly. Others think something worse happened. Either way, that house has been cursed ever since." Roberto dismissed the woman's superstitions as neighborhood gossip, But as he entered the house for the first time, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The interior was a time capsule from 15 years ago, with furniture still in place and personal belongings scattered throughout the rooms, as if the occupants had left in a hurry. Family photographs on the mantelpiece showed a young couple with 2 small children, all smiling at the camera. But there was something in their eyes, even in those happy moments, that suggested underlying tension. The man, who Roberto assumed was Mr. Santos, had the weathered look of someone who worked with his hands, but his expensive watch and gold chain suggested income beyond what most manual laborers could afford. The renovation work itself seemed straightforward enough. Years of neglect had caused water damage to several walls, and Roberto's job was to remove the damaged sections and rebuild them properly. It was honest work that would take several weeks to complete, providing steady income during a time when his family desperately needed it. But as Roberto began removing the damaged drywall in the living room, he discovered that the house held secrets that went far beyond simple structural problems. The first sign came when he noticed that one section of wall sounded different when he tapped it with his hammer. Instead of the solid thunk of studs behind drywall, this area produced a hollow echo that suggested empty space. Roberto carefully removed a larger section of the damaged wall, expecting to find some kind of architectural quirk or perhaps evidence of previous repair work. What he found instead would change his life forever and set in motion a chain of events that would destroy everything he held dear. Behind the wall, carefully wrapped in plastic and tucked into the space between the studs, were packages that Roberto initially mistook for building materials. But as he pulled one of the packages free and examined it more closely, his hands began to tremble. The package contained more money than Roberto had ever seen in his life. Stack after stack of bills, all large denominations, all carefully bundled with rubber bands. And this was just one package among dozens that filled the wall cavity. Roberto's first instinct was to call the police immediately. But as he sat on the dusty floor, surrounded by more wealth than he had ever imagined, other thoughts began to creep into his mind. This money could solve every problem his family faced. Miguel could go to any college he wanted. Sophia could have the clothes and opportunities her friends took for granted. Carmen could quit her exhausting job at the diner and maybe even go back to school to become the nurse she had always dreamed of being. For nearly an hour, Roberto sat in that empty house, staring at the fortune that had literally fallen into his hands. Outside, he could hear the sounds of normal life continuing. Children playing in the street, cars passing by, neighbors going about their daily routines. But inside that house, Roberto was making a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of calling the authorities, he carefully rewrapped the packages and hid them in his truck. He would take them home, count them properly, and then decide what to do. Just a temporary measure, he told himself. He needed time to think clearly about the best course of action. But as Roberto drove home that evening, with a fortune hidden under his tools, he had already crossed a line that he would never be able to uncross. And somewhere in the city, people who were missing that money were beginning to ask very dangerous questions about who might have found it. Chapter 2. That night, Roberto waited until Carmen and the children were asleep before carrying the packages into their small garage. Under the harsh light of a single bulb, he carefully unwrapped each bundle and began the surreal task of counting more money than he had ever dreamed of possessing. The final tally was staggering. Nearly $2 million in cash, all in bills that showed signs of heavy circulation. This wasn't money from a bank robbery or a recent crime. These bills had been handled many times, passed through countless transactions, and hidden away by someone who clearly had no intention of reporting it to tax authorities. Roberto's mind raced as he tried to understand what he had stumbled into. Who hides $2 million in the walls of a house? Why had the Santos family disappeared so suddenly, leaving this fortune behind? And most importantly, what would happen to him and his family if the wrong people discovered that he had found it? As dawn approached, Roberto made a decision that he would regret for the rest of his life. Instead of turning the money over to police, he decided to keep it. But he wouldn't be reckless about it. He would be smart, careful and gradual in how he used it. Small improvements to their life that wouldn't attract attention. Maybe a better car, some new clothes for the kids, repairs to their house. Nothing flashy that would make people ask questions. For the first few days, Roberto felt like he was living in a dream. He paid off their credit card debt, bought Carmen the new washing machine she had been wanting for years, and surprised the children with new school supplies and clothes. Each purchase brought genuine joy to his family, and Roberto began to convince himself that he was simply redistributing wealth from people who clearly didn't need it to a family that desperately did. But the euphoria was short-lived. On his fourth day back at the Santos house, Roberto noticed a black sedan parked across the street with two men inside who seemed to be watching the property. When he left for lunch, the car followed him to the restaurant. When he returned, it was back in its original position. That afternoon, Mrs. Gonzalez approached him again, but this time her nervousness had escalated to visible fear. "Those men have been asking questions about you," she whispered, glancing toward the black sedan. "They wanted to know your name, where you live, if you found anything unusual in the house." Roberto's blood ran cold. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing. I told them I mind my own business. But they know you're working here, and they're very interested in what you might have discovered." Roberto tried to continue working normally, but concentration was impossible. Every sound from outside made him jump. Every shadow that passed by the windows made his heart race. By the end of the day, he was convinced that his secret had somehow been discovered. That evening, Roberto sat his family down for what he claimed was just a normal dinner conversation. But his real purpose was to gauge whether they had noticed anything unusual. "Has anyone called looking for me?" he asked casually. "Or maybe stopped by the house?" Carmen looked puzzled. "No. Why would they?" "Any strangers in the neighborhood asking questions?" "Dad, you're acting weird," Sophia said, pushing food around her plate. "What's wrong?" Roberto forced a smile. "Nothing's wrong. I just heard there have been some break-ins in the area, so I wanted to make sure everyone is being careful." But Miguel, who at 17 was old enough to sense when adults were hiding something important, studied his father's face with concern. "Dad, are you in some kind of trouble?" The directness of the question caught Roberto off guard. For a moment, he considered telling his family everything. The money, the fear, the growing certainty that he had made a terrible mistake. But looking at their faces around the dinner table, Carmen tired from her double shifts, Sophia excited about the new clothes he had bought her, Miguel worried about college applications, Roberto couldn't bring himself to shatter their happiness with the truth. "No trouble, son, just being cautious." But as the family went about their evening routines, Roberto stood at the kitchen window, scanning the street for signs of surveillance. And there, parked under a broken streetlight 3 houses down, was the same black sedan he had seen at the job site. Roberto spent that night researching the Santos family online, trying to understand what he had gotten himself into. What he found in old newspaper archives made his hands shake as he typed. Eduardo Santos had been a mid-level accountant for several import-export businesses, but police had suspected him of involvement in money laundering operations. 3 months before the family's disappearance, Santos had been questioned in connection with a major drug trafficking investigation, though no charges were filed. The family's disappearance had been sudden and complete. Neighbors reported that they simply vanished one night, leaving behind their house, their car, and, according to police reports, most of their personal belongings. The case had remained open for several years, before being classified as a missing persons matter with suspected foul play. But it was the final article that made Roberto's blood turn to ice. 2 years after the Santos family disappeared, Eduardo Santos's body had been found in a river 50 miles away. The cause of death was listed as drowning, but the circumstances suggested murder. The other family members, Santos's wife and 2 young children, had never been found. Roberto now understood exactly what he had discovered in that wall. This wasn't just hidden money, it was blood money, connected to drug trafficking and murder. And the people who had hidden it there were not the type to simply write off a $2 million loss. As he sat in his dark kitchen at 3 in the morning, Roberto finally faced the full magnitude of his situation. He had stolen money from killers. He had brought their attention to his family. And there was no way to return the money without admitting that he had taken it in the first place. Outside, the black sedan remained in its position under the broken streetlight, and Roberto knew that his family's peaceful life was about to end forever. What do you think about Roberto's situation so far? Leave your opinion in the comments about whether he should have taken the money, or if there was another way to handle this discovery. Chapter 3. Roberto barely slept that night, and when morning came, he made a decision that would prove to be his final mistake. Instead of going to the police or finding a way to anonymously return the money, he decided to continue working at the Santos house as if nothing had happened. He convinced himself that acting normally was the best way to avoid suspicion. But normalcy was no longer possible. The black sedan followed him to work, and throughout the day, Roberto felt eyes watching his every move. When he took lunch breaks, different cars with different men seemed to materialize from nowhere. When he went to the hardware store for supplies, someone was always browsing nearby, listening to his conversations with the clerks. It was during his lunch break on that Tuesday that Roberto's world began to collapse completely. His phone rang, and Carmen's voice was tight with fear. "Roberto, there are men at the house asking about you. They say they're from the government, but they don't look like any government workers I've ever seen." Roberto's hands began to shake. "What did they want?" "They're asking about your work, about where you've been spending your time, about whether you've brought anything unusual home recently." "Roberto, what's happening? Why are these people interested in you?" "I'll be right there," Roberto said. But even as he spoke, he knew it was too late to protect his family from the consequences of his decision. When Roberto arrived home, the men were gone, but Carmen was pacing the living room like a caged animal. Sophia sat on the couch, her face pale with confusion and fear. Miguel stood by the window, watching the street with the hyper-awareness of someone who sensed danger. "They weren't government workers," Carmen said without preamble. "Government workers don't have tattoos covering their hands, and don't ask questions about whether you've found anything interesting at work." Roberto sank into his chair, finally understanding that his attempts to keep his family in the dark had only made things worse. These people clearly knew about the money, and they were methodically closing in on him. "Carmen, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully without interrupting." For the next hour, Roberto told his family everything. The discovery in the wall, the decision to keep the money, the research he had done about the Santos family, and his growing realization that they were all in terrible danger. The silence that followed his confession was deafening. Carmen stared at him with an expression that mixed disbelief, anger, and terror in equal measure. "You brought drug money into our house," she whispered. "You put our children at risk for money." "I thought I could handle it," Roberto said weakly. "I thought if I was careful—" "Careful?" Carmen's voice rose to a shout. "You stole $2 million from people who murder entire families, and you thought you could be careful enough to get away with it?" Miguel stepped away from the window, his face grave beyond his 17 years. "Dad, we need to give the money back. Now. Tonight." It's not that simple, Roberto said. If I try to return it, they'll know I took it. They'll kill me anyway, just to send a message. And if we don't return it? Sophia asked, her voice small and frightened. Roberto couldn't bring himself to answer that question honestly, but the answer hung in the air like a death sentence. That night, the family packed essential belongings and drove to Carmen's sister's house in a neighboring state. Roberto had convinced himself that distance would buy them time to figure out a solution, but he was learning that when you steal from killers, there is no safe distance. For 3 days, they stayed at Carmen's sister's house, sleeping poorly and jumping at every unexpected sound. Roberto spent hours online, researching witness protection programs and trying to find a way to contact law enforcement without admitting his own crimes. But on the 4th morning, Carmen's sister Maria answered the door to find 2 men in suits who politely but firmly insisted on speaking with Roberto about a matter of mutual interest. Roberto knew immediately that running had been pointless. These people had resources and connections that made hiding impossible. When he sat down across from the 2 men in Maria's living room, he was looking into the faces of professional killers who had tracked him across state lines as easily as following a roadmap. "Mr. Silva," the older man said, with the calm voice of someone who had conducted this type of conversation many times before, "we believe you may have found something that belongs to our organization. We're prepared to be reasonable about this situation, but our patience has limits." "I don't know what you're talking about," Roberto said, but his voice betrayed his fear. "The Santos house," the younger man interjected. "You've been working there for 2 weeks. You discovered our operations emergency fund. We want it back." Roberto's mind raced. If he denied everything, they would hurt his family to force the truth. If he admitted taking the money, they would kill him anyway. "If I had found something like that," Roberto said carefully, "what would happen to my family if I returned it?" The older man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Your family's safety depends entirely on your cooperation and your ability to keep quiet about things that don't concern you. And if I return everything, you'll leave us alone. We're businessmen, Mr. Silva. We don't create unnecessary problems for ourselves, but we also don't tolerate theft." Roberto agreed to return the money, but as he prepared to drive back to retrieve it, he knew he was walking into a trap. These men had no intention of letting his family live with knowledge of their operation. The Santos family's fate had already shown what happened to people who knew too much. That afternoon, as Roberto loaded the packages of money into his truck for what he knew would be his final journey, he called Carmen from a payphone. "Take the children and go to your mother's house," he said. "Don't pack anything. Don't tell anyone where you're going. Just leave now." "Roberto, what are you doing?" "I'm trying to fix the mistake I made, but if you don't hear from me by tomorrow morning, call the police and tell them everything. Don't try to protect me. Just tell them the truth and get as far away from here as possible." Carmen was crying now. "Roberto, please. There has to be another way." "I love you," Roberto said, "and I'm sorry for what I've done to our family." As Roberto hung up the phone and drove toward his appointment with the men who were waiting for the money, he finally understood the true cost of his decision. He hadn't just stolen money. He had traded his family's safety and his own life for a momentary fantasy of easy wealth. The money was still in his truck, every bill accounted for. But Roberto knew that returning it wouldn't save him. Some mistakes can't be undone, and some prices can't be negotiated. Thank you so much for staying with us this far in this incredible story. We truly appreciate your dedication as a viewer, and believe me, the best is yet to come. What follows will show us the devastating conclusion of Roberto's choices and their impact on everyone he loved. Chapter 4. Roberto arrived at the designated meeting point, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the industrial district, knowing that he was likely driving to his death. But he had also made one final decision that might give his family a chance to survive. He had contacted investigative journalist Patricia Mendez before leaving the motel. Patricia had built her reputation exposing organized crime connections, and Roberto hoped that the threat of media attention might provide some protection for Carmen and the children. He had given her copies of everything he had found in the Santos house, along with detailed information about the men who were pursuing him. "If something happens to me," Roberto had told her during their brief phone conversation, "these people need to be exposed. My family deserves justice, even if I don't." The warehouse district was a maze of empty buildings and broken streetlights, the kind of place where screams would go unheard and bodies could disappear without a trace. As Roberto parked his truck in front of the specified building, he saw the same black sedan that had been following him, along with two other vehicles he didn't recognize. The older man from the previous day emerged from the sedan, accompanied by 4 other men whose body language and positioning suggested military or law enforcement training. Roberto understood that he was facing a professional operation, not street-level criminals. "Mr. Silva," the older man said as Roberto stepped out of his truck, "I trust you've brought what belongs to us." Roberto nodded toward the truck bed, where the packages of money lay concealed under a tarp. "It's all there. Every dollar." "Good. But before we conclude our business, we need to discuss your future relationship with our organization." Roberto had expected this. "What kind of relationship?" "The kind where you never speak about what you've seen, never contact law enforcement, and never do anything that might complicate our operations. In exchange, your family continues to enjoy good health. And if I agree to these terms, then you return to your normal life, and we pretend this unfortunate misunderstanding never happened." But as the men began moving the money from Roberto's truck to their vehicles, Roberto noticed something that confirmed his worst fears. One of the men was carrying the kind of plastic sheeting and tools typically used for body disposal. They had never intended to let him leave this warehouse alive. Roberto's hand moved slowly toward his phone, where he had pre-recorded a message for the journalist. If he could activate the voice memo feature, it might capture evidence of what was about to happen. "There is one more matter," the older man continued. "We've done some research on your family. Your wife works at the Sunrise Diner, your son attends Central High School, and your daughter takes dance classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Lovely children. It would be unfortunate if their father's poor judgment affected their futures." The threat was unmistakable, but it also revealed crucial information that Roberto knew the journalist would find valuable. These people had been watching his family for days, gathering intelligence for future leverage or elimination. "I understand," Roberto said, his finger finding the record button on his phone. "I want to make sure my family stays safe." "Of course you do. But you see, Mr. Silva, people who steal from us create a credibility problem. Other workers, other people who might find our property need to understand that there are serious consequences for theft." As the man spoke, Roberto could see the other men positioning themselves around the warehouse, cutting off possible escape routes. But he also noticed something else: a police surveillance van poorly concealed behind a dumpster across the street. Patricia Mendez had apparently contacted law enforcement immediately after Roberto's call, and they had followed him to the warehouse. Roberto realized that his choice to involve the journalist might have saved not only his family, but his own life. "The problem with witnesses," the older man continued, apparently unaware of the police presence, "is that they sometimes develop guilty consciences. They start thinking about talking to reporters or law enforcement. We can't allow that kind of uncertainty in our operations." Roberto kept the phone recording as the man detailed their organization's methods for handling security problems. He was providing enough evidence to bring down a significant criminal operation, assuming he survived long enough for the police to act. The situation escalated quickly when one of the criminals noticed movement around the police van. "We have a problem," he called out. "We're not alone here." Suddenly, The warehouse was illuminated by high-powered police lights, and loudspeakers crackled to life. "This is the police. The building is surrounded. Exit the warehouse with your hands visible." What followed was chaos. The criminals attempted to use Roberto as a hostage while simultaneously trying to destroy the evidence they had just recovered. In the confusion, Roberto managed to escape into the maze of warehouse equipment while gunfire erupted around him. The police operation had been hastily organized based on Patricia Mendez's information, but it was effective. Within an hour, all 5 criminals were in custody, and Roberto was giving statements that would eventually dismantle a major money laundering operation, but the victory came at a devastating cost. During the shootout, the older man, later identified as Antonio Vega, a high-ranking figure in an international drug trafficking organization, had managed to make one final phone call before his arrest. By the time Roberto was released from police custody and reunited with his family, it was too late to prevent the consequences of that call. Chapter 5. The arrest of Antonio Vega and his associates had indeed disrupted a major criminal organization, but it had also painted a permanent target on Roberto's family. Within hours of the warehouse raid, Carmen received a phone call that would haunt her for years. "Your husband cost us a lot of money and several valuable associates," the voice said calmly. "We want you to know that this debt will be collected, if not from him, then from those he loves." The police immediately placed the family in protective custody, but the damage to their lives was already complete. Their house had been burned to the ground while they were hidden in safe houses. Carmen's sister Maria had been beaten unconscious by men looking for information about their whereabouts. Even Roberto's elderly parents had been threatened and forced to abandon their home. "Everything we built is gone," Carmen said during one of their meetings with federal marshals. "Our house, our community, our sense of safety. Even if we survive this, how do we ever have normal lives again?" Roberto sat beside his wife in the sterile conference room, watching his children struggle to process the destruction of their world. Miguel, now 18, had missed his high school graduation and college entrance exams. Sofia, 16, had been forced to cut contact with all her friends and abandon the dance program she loved. The federal prosecutor handling the case was sympathetic but realistic about their options. "Mr. Silva's testimony has been crucial in building our case against the Vega organization," Agent Martinez explained. "But these people have long memories and extensive resources. Even with Vega in custody, his associates are still active." "What are our choices?" Roberto asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Witness protection, new identities, relocation to another state, complete separation from your previous life. It's the only way to guarantee your family's safety." Roberto had thought that stealing the money was the worst decision he could make, but he was learning that every choice thereafter had led to even greater losses. Now he faced the ultimate consequence. His family would have to cease to exist in order to survive. The months that followed were a blur of bureaucratic procedures and psychological evaluations. New names, new social security numbers, new birth certificates. The Silva family died on paper, and the Thompson family was born in their place. They were relocated to a small town in a different region entirely, where Roberto found work with a construction company that specialized in affordable housing projects. It was honest work that reminded him daily of the values he had abandoned when he decided to keep the hidden money. Carmen eventually found employment as a school secretary, and both children adjusted to new schools and new identities. But the cost of survival was measured in the permanent loss of everything that had made them who they were. Roberto never stopped regretting his decision, but he also came to understand something important about himself and human nature. He had not been corrupted by evil intentions. He had been a good man who made a terrible choice when faced with extraordinary temptation. "I tell myself that any father in my situation might have made the same mistake," Roberto confided to the counselor assigned to help his family adjust to their new lives. But that doesn't make it less devastating for the people I was supposed to protect. The counselor nodded sympathetically. Guilt is part of your healing process, Roberto. But so is understanding that you ultimately chose your family's safety over your own pride when you contacted the journalist. 3 years after the warehouse raid, Roberto received news that brought a complex mixture of relief and sadness. Antonio Vega had been found dead in his prison cell, apparently killed by members of a rival organization who blamed him for the disruption of their money laundering operations. "Does this mean we're safe?" Sophia asked when Roberto shared the news. She was now 19, attending college under her new identity, but still looked over her shoulder everywhere she went. "It means we're safer," Roberto replied carefully, "but it doesn't undo what I did or bring back the life we lost." Miguel, now working as an apprentice electrician while attending community college, had grown into a young man who understood the weight of his father's choices. "Dad, I've been thinking about something," he said during one of their weekend dinners. "What you did was wrong, but you also stopped those people from hurting other families. The police said your testimony helped them arrest dozens of people and shut down operations in 3 states. Roberto nodded slowly. "But I wonder how many families we could have saved if I had just called the police the moment I found that money." "You can't change the past," Carmen said quietly. She had aged years in the span of months, but she had also found a strength that surprised them all. "But you can make sure our children understand the real cost of dishonesty." Roberto had indeed learned to appreciate the luxury of honest work and the peace that comes from sleeping without secrets. His new job paid less than his previous work, but he went home each day knowing that he had earned every dollar legitimately. The irony was not lost on him that he now lived a richer life on less money than he had ever imagined possible when he first discovered that fortune in the wall. One evening, as Roberto walked home from work through their new neighborhood, he passed a construction site where other workers were building homes for young families. He stopped to watch them, remembering his old dreams about starting a woodworking business, about the Ted's woodworking techniques he had once thought might change his life. He realized now that he had always possessed the skills to improve his family's situation through honest effort and dedication. The money in the wall had seemed like a shortcut, but it had actually been the longest, most destructive path he could have chosen. Roberto pulled out his phone and looked up information about woodworking classes offered by the local community college. It was time to pursue his dreams the right way, building something lasting through patience and integrity rather than quick fixes and stolen wealth. That night, as his family gathered around their modest dinner table in their small rental house, Roberto looked at each face and felt something he hadn't experienced since the day he found the money. Genuine contentment. They had lost everything they owned, but they had kept everything that truly mattered. And perhaps more importantly, Roberto had learned that some opportunities that seem like blessings are actually curses in disguise, while the real opportunities for happiness are usually hiding in plain sight, waiting for us to notice them through honest effort and gradual progress. The scars would never completely heal, and they would always live with the knowledge that their safety depended on remaining hidden. But Roberto had finally understood that integrity isn't just about following rules. It's about protecting the people you love from the consequences of your choices. And in their new life, built on the foundation of hard-learned lessons, Roberto was determined to make only choices that his children could be proud of, even if they never knew the full story of how much those lessons had cost. This story teaches us that some opportunities that seem like blessings are actually curses in disguise. Roberto learned the hard way that easy money always comes with a price too high to pay. Sometimes honesty is the only protection we have against the consequences of our choices. What would you do if you found a fortune hidden? Tell us your opinion in the comments. If this story impacted you, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications for more surprising real stories. Don't miss the next video with another story that will leave you speechless.